Well, I guess it's my job to kick it off, right? By having the pleasure of introducing our speaker and instructor today, Ricky Abzug. Known Ricky for a very long time. Not even sure I want to count the years, but I do remember her first being a PhD student at Yale University under, I think, Paul DiMaggio, right? Who was director of the program on nonprofit PONPO, Program on Nonprofit Organizations. Yeah, that's what it stands for. Nobody ever said that. They always said just PONPO. But, Ricky was, a very impressive student. And in fact, along the way, became the associate director of that program, probably at the age of 18, 19. I don't know, you were very young. And, since then, she's become a prominent member of the research and teaching community on nonprofit organizations. She's currently at the School of Business at Ramapo College of New Jersey, which we were talking earlier. I now know where it is. Done really quite a few things, but in terms of networks, a couple of things that I remember. Shortly after 9/11, she worked with some colleagues to actually study the impact of that terrible disaster on nonprofit organizations in the general area of Lower Manhattan. And my recollection is that, one of the things they found was that those organizations that were better connected through networks to other organizations, outside that area, were in a much better position to, survive and continue their operations. She was also involved in a very kind of a major study of networks in a different sense, working with colleagues in different cities to investigate, I think, what they called interlocking boards. What were the connections between people on one major board of a nonprofit and another, and they discovered, these networks of people that were bringing, in some sense, connecting all of these nonprofit organizations together into networks. So actually, I'm terribly pleased that she has joined this program, and she's going to, talk about her understanding of networks and how they contribute to the resilience of nonprofit organizations. So here you go, Ricky Abzug. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Dennis. And yeah, it's scary to think how long we've known each other, but wonderful that you've been part of my life for so long. So very touching, actually. So welcome all. I'm going to start by sharing my screen so that you can get an idea of where we're going, but I'm hoping to leave a lot of room for all of us to participate as the need strikes us. So let's see if I'm sharing right now. Okay, beautiful. Okay, and I'm assuming yes, excellent. All right, okay, let me figure out how to drive this from my end. So let me just give you an overview. I believe many of you have been to another session like this, so you kind of get, you already have an idea of the flow. For those of you who are new to this, let me tell you how this is going to work. Basically, the first half of the session is going to be more classroom-like, if you will, driven by slides, myself, and then some breakout rooms, and an opportunity for you all to talk to each other in a sort of structured way. We'll break for lunch around 12:30, I think is the usual time, so about a half an hour. And during that time, if you could take a look at the Dress for Success case study that I'm hoping you all have access to, that would be great. When we come back at 1 o'clock, that's when we really hit, as far as I'm concerned, the best part of the session, because I'm going to be bringing in some nonprofit networkers for you. In fact, we've got one of us joining already, which is great. And so we'll have this panel of expert networkers. I'll have some questions for them prepared, but I also want to give you all an opportunity to ask them whatever questions you have. And then in the last part of this session, we'll talk about Dress for Success. So, and I think we're going to be really lucky, because I think Kim Iuzzi from Dress for Success, who the case is written about, will be joining us as well. So she'll kind of be checking in to make sure that everybody understands what's really going on. But even better, she'll be able to give us an update about what Dress for Success has done from a network perspective. But for that first couple of hours, when it's just me and you guys, I do want to make sure that we all have a chance to introduce ourselves to each other, because Stuart and I were talking before the session, and one of the hidden agendas of this session is to help you all form a new network. And that network consists of the people who are also interested in networking in this session. So, you know, there's a hidden curriculum as well as an overt curriculum, and the hidden one is for you to actually get started networking through this. So we'll do introductions, and we'll do some ice-breaking networks, and then a whole host of different things I'm going to throw at you to basically get at some network theory, because we all kind of know what a network is, but there's actually some theory behind it. And knowing the theory will actually help you be more effective in both your own network, your organizational network, and then importantly, in the networks that as communities, we need to be resilient. Because, you know, ultimately, that's why we're here, is for resilience. And the cool thing about network theory is a lot of the ideas behind it can be applied at those three different levels: at the level of the individual, at the level of the organization, at the level of the entire community. So we'll be talking about that. We'll talk about some specific lessons from disasters. Dennis mentioned the work that I had done on 9/11, actually with another Dennis at the New School. So I want to tell you a little bit more about that and our findings, and specifically how networks helped with resilience. And then before we break for lunch, I want to really get into some strategies, some how-tos. You know, how do you actually make networks as nonprofits? What kind of networks are available to you? What are the costs of those networks? And what are the benefits? Then we'll break for lunch. So before I do any introductions, are there any questions about the agenda? Okay, and I can't see all of you because I haven't figured that out yet, but let me see if I can. Okay, well, I can see more of you now. Okay. So for introductions, I thought we'd start with a round the room introduction. I know a lot of us know each other, but not everybody does. But to keep us targeted, I thought it might be fun for you to tell us your name, the organization that you're affiliated with, whatever title you have, and then a time you blew everyone away at work. Something that you did that just blew everybody away, because everything we do today is going to be intentional, and we're going to try to share stuff that people can use as hints and tips where they are. I'm trying to see, I don't have, still don't have everybody on my screen. Let me see if I can make this screen bigger so that I can see everybody. Yeah, I'm getting there. Okay. So let's see, I'm gonna do alphabetical order by first name, because that's fun. So Dennis, you can start us out.
Here we go. My name is Dennis Young. I'm emeritus professor at 2 universities now. Obviously, I think I'm retired. Case Western Reserve University and Georgia State University. Time I blew everyone away. Probably when I took my Roland will appreciate this. So when I took, I was having struggles getting people to really understand what I was talking about in my economics class. So I brought my banjo and sang some songs to them to try to illustrate some points. People thought it was pretty odd.
Excellent. Welcome, Dennis. Elizabeth, I guess you're up next.
Hi, everyone. I am Elizabeth Searing. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Dallas. And I was actually struggling to think of like you said, a high bar, starting us off here, Ricky. I don't know if I've ever like blown anyone away at work, but taking a cue from Dennis in terms of teaching, I actually got some cred from one of my teenagers the other day because I shared what I did when I taught microeconomics when I was a grad student. And I don't think it's innovative because I know other people that have done it, but in order to illustrate diminishing marginal utility, I asked the class to nominate someone, and so of course they nominated the popular jock of the class, and we fed him donuts until he was sick. Not like literally sick, but he didn't have donuts, from what I understand, for quite some time after that. So drove home the point, but yeah.
Perfect. Gabriel, are you feeling up to participating?
Yeah, I can talk. Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm Gabriel Brunel. I work at Towards Employment. It's a not-for-profit in downtown Cleveland, and I'm the assistant controller there. Time that I blew some people away at work was a work outing, and it wasn't everybody. It was just quite a few people from my job, and we had a beer chugging competition, and I won. So good old college trick. So still got it in me.
Excellent. And maybe later in the session, if it gets a little boring, we're going to ask you to do that, even if we can't see you.
That works.
All right, Jesse.
I'm Jessie Malkin. I work for the United Jewish Community of the Virginia Peninsula. We are currently on a full-on snow/virtual day for 1/4 inch of snow. So my whole family will be in and out of this Zoom all day long, and I apologize in advance. I'm the program director, and I really enjoy video editing as like a side thing. I used to teach years ago, I worked at the Apple Store and taught some of the workshops. So I've become by default the in-house editor. And recently I took a video that I'd edited together for our donors about our Reimagine Summer Camp campaign, and just re-edited, recut it. And it is now our promotional video for camp. And it's amazing how cutting, 4 minutes off and stop talking about the numbers and how it becomes a fun summer camp video.
Beautiful. Welcome, Jesse. Jody.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jody Abzug, and perhaps my most esteemed role right now is Sister of Ricky. But beyond that, I'm the Director of Development and Alumni Programs at the Foot School, which is a K-9 independent school in New Haven. And we are one of the sites in Connecticut that has a Horizons program, which I'll talk more about when I address at the panel. But I guess I've been a fundraiser for 30 years, so certainly there have been a number of times I've brought in tremendous gifts that have blown people away. But I think for today's purposes, perhaps when I came to Foot 4 years ago, I brought with me the idea of a giving day and 24 hours of giving online, asking a lot of people who'd already given. And most of my colleagues thought I was crazy. And the first time out, we had over 200 donors that day. So that was very yes, including Ricky, which was incredibly inspirational. And so hopefully any kind of development-y type or fundraising questions that arise during the day, happy to answer.
Nara.
Hi, nice meeting you. I'm Nara Yoon. I just joined the School of Strategic Leadership Studies at James Madison University. And I've been, thank you. And I'm very excited about this session, especially because I wrote my dissertation about the interlocking directorates in the nonprofit organization. And I read your studies with Dr. Glassbricks. So that was really motivating piece that helped my dissertation, how to form my dissertation. So it's a pleasure to meet with you, and thank you for having this session. And because I'm prepping for the courses for my student this semester, I hope that I blow away my students with my beautiful slides and the course materials that I've been up to. So that's one thing that I wanted to share with you.
Terrific, thank you. All right, my alphabetical order is not great when I'm using first names, but I think Roland, you're next.
What about you?
Oh, well, Dennis introduced me, but if you want, okay, at time I blew everyone away at work. So this, I often do three truths and a lie. I don't know if any of the instructors have ever done that, but I do that consistently, and I'll do that in seminars and workplaces as well. And somehow not, so my three lies, my three truths and a lie are usually, let me see if I remember them exactly. I give people the let's see, well, I wrote a paper with a 4-star general. I ran an institute at Yale University. I was an Olympic trial swimmer, and I don't remember the third one or fourth one, whatever. And so then I asked people, which is the lie? And for those of you who've seen me in person, I'm a little thing, and I don't look particularly strong. And so everybody just assumes that the lie is that I was an Olympic trial athlete. But it turns out that actually was true. And I did actually swim in an Olympic trial for synchronized swimming. I think I might have the distinction of being the worst athlete to ever participate in an Olympic trial, but it still gets to be a truth. And the lie was that I never wrote a paper with a general. So I consistently blow people away with the idea that somebody like me could be in an Olympic trial. Roland, you're on.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Roland Kushner, a professor of business at Muhlenberg College. Always happy to reconnect with Ricky and Elizabeth and Dennis. Time I blew everybody away at work. So in nonprofit work, I invited the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese to lunch at the college cafeteria and negotiated a spinoff of the human service organization where I was the board chair from the Episcopal Diocese. And he said, "You don't need us, we don't need you." So now we network, and the diocese being the having formal authority over the organization. So, and that was very successful. It happened several years ago, and the diocese is still a big contributor, but they don't have to approve who our board of directors are anymore. So over a sandwich at the college cafeteria, that's how it's done.
Love it. And again, as we're talking, I'm hoping you guys are taking mental notes, because if something resonates with you, my goodness, use it. Stuart, bring us on home with this.
Well, unfortunately, the first things I thought about are all the mistakes I've been making over the years. But one of the things I'm particularly proud of is one of those times where you just happen to be in the right place at the right time. And when I was at the Levin College, I had the nicest office on the dean's floor. And when one of the local politicians retired, he came to our college, and I offered him my office. And the benefit of that is I got access to the governor, the legislature, the other state officials. So it was a small price to pay. I made good use of it, if you'll, rather than go into detail for an hour. I guess the other thing, I have a sports allegory too. Ricky, you'll appreciate this. I'm kind of short and small, but I'm quick, really quick. And when I started playing soccer in high school, I was so quick, they put me in the goal. And what I've discovered is a lifelong lesson that if you show the least bit of competence, you're always going to play goalie, no matter what the situation. Take that as you will, but 1,000 games later.
All right. right, well, thank you all. So we have a sense of who's in the room, and I imagine that people will be bopping in and out. So maybe we'll even get a chance to put them on the spot as they come in. I want to just show you guys a networking trick to start us off, and I'm going to have to figure out how to do this in Zoom right now, and that is a speed networking exercise. So we've done this a couple times with a couple of different groups, but we can use Zoom to help us network. So, we did this sort of global piece, but you're going to find that the networks are going to get stronger when you spend a little bit more time with people. So what I'd love to do is just take about 5 minutes right now and dump you into breakout rooms with one other person. And I guess there's going to be one group with 3. We'll figure out how that works. Or maybe if I just stay out, we can work it out. And just for 5 minutes, talk to that other person about one thing that your nonprofit or a nonprofit you know and love has done particularly well during the pandemic. And this will give you a chance to actually use a new network to learn something about how another organization made it through the pandemic. So let me see now, because I have lost my, okay, here's my breakout room. All right, and I'm gonna create 4 breakout rooms. Okay, and I'll give you just 5 minutes because we want to get back and talk, but it's important for me that you all leave here with at least one new network connection, and you use that network for information purposes. So again, you're sharing what one thing your organization or an organization you know well did really well during the pandemic. All right, so I will see you back in 5 minutes. All right, Dennis made it into a room by himself. I'm not sure how that happened. Let me tell him to come back and join us.
Dennis is very creative. Well, if you want, we could chat. Do you want to chat?
Absolutely. I'm going to bring Dennis.
All right, I'm in a room by myself.
All right, Stuart, I got you back.
Okay.
All right, and Dennis should be here as well. So yeah, so what's one thing that
Whoops.
any organization, what's one thing that NCNE did really well during the pandemic?
Well, I think this program, tell you the truth. I mean, it's inspired by the fact that nonprofits were really set back in a lot of ways because of the pandemic, like a lot of other organizations, and displayed just a variety of strategies for coping with it. And so we put this program together to try to capture some of that. Stuart might have some other ideas. Stuart has built all the infrastructure, so he may have other notions on that.
I mean, I would agree with that statement. I think here's a market opportunity and we were able to take advantage of it. And depending upon how we go forward, I think we've got something really high quality that we can share. I certainly learned a lot about social media and video production, which I wouldn't have known had there been no pandemic. So, that may very well be the way the organization sustains itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think that's really important. Yeah, what worries me a little bit, at least from Ramapo, is that I think we learned a lot of things in pivoting as quickly as we did, but I fear that we're definitely one of those organizations that's so concerned about getting back to normal that we're forgetting some of the lessons we learned and some of the things we did really well during the pandemic in our rush to to return to pre-pandemic, I think we're losing a lot of good stuff, a lot of innovation that wouldn't have taken place. But you know, when you're under fire like that, you know, you have to innovate or die. And I think we're going to be losing it by just rushing back to where we were. And I worry how much, you know, all organizations are faced with that.
Yeah, just reflecting a little bit more on this program. I think it showed a downside to, well, not a downside to networks, but the fact that the way networks are structured in Cleveland left us at a disadvantage. I think, you know, we went to a whole series of foundations to try to get support for this program. And they were kind of networked together with nonprofits to just bail people out. And, you know, we got a lot of shaking heads saying, yeah, this is good, this is important, but we're not doing that now. We're bailing people out. And we were kind of an educational preventative program that, you know, seemed like a luxury to them. So it was very hard in that situation to raise any funds because, you know, they were tapped out and they were focused elsewhere.
Another interesting piece of this is that the marketplace has changed. I mean, there's the way that people consume knowledge materials is shifted from where they're willing to come spend a lot of time in one place to very short bits. And unless there's some immediate return for them, you know, they just check out.
Yeah,
and usually those short bits are free.
Right.
Well, you know, and
exactly.
I think the attention span of Gen Z drives that as well. Meanwhile, I've just ended the breakout room, so people will start repopulating here in a second. But yeah, there's this whole short bit thing, and actually, we can talk about that within networks. There might be some use for that theory in trying to figure out how we can work with shorter attention span as well. So welcome back, Jesse and Nara.
Hi.
So you guys came back of your own accord. You weren't booted out yet. Okay, so other folks will be booted out very shortly.
We just wrapped up and came back.
Good. Okay, good. And I see that, yes, everybody else is booted out. All right, terrific. All right, so if you wanted to promote networking in a group and you had a Zoom type of opportunity to do that, one of the things that you could do is actually use that kind of breakout room session. The smaller the breakout rooms, the better. Bring people back, and then for a speed networking thing, reshuffle them and then do breakout rooms again with different people in the room. And that's just a really quick way to, you know, help people network. And the one-on-one gives you a better opportunity than this, you know, grand gallery view to put a name to a face and then use that after the session is over. So again, you know, sort of experiential learning there, or learning by doing. So I've just, you know, given you your first network lesson. But as I promised, I will introduce you to some network theory. So, you know, I'm just not making this stuff up. So I'm coming back to my slides here. Okay, and oh, yeah, I'm sharing screen. Yes, you can all see my slides. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. So here's something that the economists in the room may know, but the rest of us may not have known, and that is network theory actually derives from very early theory on how humans do economic transactions, really any kinds of transactions. What's amazing to me is that it really wasn't until the 1930s when economists themselves tried to understand why we even had firms. Because, you know, if you've had any economics training, you know you always start with market transactions. And economists are excellent in sort of figuring out why markets develop, how markets develop, information in markets, all kinds of things about markets. But from a theoretical standpoint, firms shouldn't exist in economics, right? I mean, if you want something, you go out and buy it. Why in the world would you ever bring people together in a building to do all these transactions when you could just do it in that traditional spot market? So in 1937, again, so this is, thousands of years of human history and, at least a couple hundred years of economic theory. In 1937, Ronald Coase actually wrote the first theory of the firm to sort of explain to economists why firms existed and how firms, organizations, are actually alternative means for organizing similar transactions. This was blowing to economists, so much so that Ron Coase got a Nobel Prize for telling people why firms developed when the rest of us were organizing firms forever. And in fact, interesting side history, or at least interesting to me, the very first corporations, do you guys know where the first corporations came from, or where the term corporation itself even came from?
It's in the Roman code, isn't it?
Absolutely, Roland, you teach the same stuff I do, so yes, it is. So the very notion of corporation goes back to at least 500 AD with the Roman code, and of course, once again, 500 AD is when we started forming these things. 1937 is when economists realized, hey, there's something out there. But the whole notion of bringing people together to do something because together they can accomplish more than one person alone goes back actually to Roman times. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the code and you see what kinds of corporations were given legal status, it's things like colleges, universities, political groups, religious associations. Everything that forms the current US nonprofit sector is actually what's in the Roman code. There was no such thing as a for-profit entity back then, but the real foundation of the nonprofit sector is in this code. All right, so anyway, it took economists up until the 1930s to at least establish that there was a market and a firm as two different ways to do transactions. And once Ron Coase won the Nobel Prize, economists basically ignored him for about 40 years. And then Oliver Williamson, another economist, decided to delve deeper into this notion of why would we have a firm when we can just do a spot market? And Williamson basically suggested that there are times when you'll have a market, when exchanges are straightforward, when they're non-repetitive, when you don't have specific investment. But there are times when you don't have those conditions and you need another form of economic organization, and that's when hierarchies arise. And those are transactions that involve more uncertainty. They actually recur more frequently. So it's not like, taking your cow to market and selling the milk to a random person and then bringing it home. But this is something that needs to happen all the time. And also there are times when you require transition-specific investments. And when those conditions hold, the spot market doesn't work. And from an economist perspective, that's why we have organizations. So transactions actually move out of markets over history into hierarchies as the knowledge specific to a transaction builds up. So this was 1975. Now, this is all pretty intuitive stuff. Williamson got a Nobel Prize for this brilliant theory. Okay, so just to show you, how it takes economists a little bit longer to bring them up to speed with the rest of us. But by 1975, economists realized that organizations are kind of here; they're not going away, and they offer an alternative for transactions. But even this continuum between market and firm isn't quite enough to explain all the good stuff that happens when parties want to do transactions. And this is where networks comes in. Okay, so and again, why does network seem so new? Because Williamson got a Nobel Prize for just recognizing there was a freaking firm in 1975. So this is our starting base for all of this stuff. But basically, where network theory came in is once Williamson and his transactions costs make the big splash in Sweden, people realize that there's still some complexity out there that market and firm don't really speak to. They don't get at that. And they don't capture the reality of life. And specifically, there's some forms of exchange that are more social, that are dependent upon relationships. Even the employment relationship in a firm is contract-based. But there are some transactions that don't need contracts, that don't need the formality of the firm. They're not completely anonymous like the market, but they're somewhere in between because there's a social element to them. And they're more dependent on mutual interests and reputation. So when that entanglement of obligation and reputation reaches a point where two bodies are actually becoming interdependent, there's no common ownership or legal framework. And that's where the whole network concept comes in. When organizations are involved in this intricate lattice work of collaborative ventures with other organizations, which could be competitors, this network form, is a little bit lighter of a lift than a hierarchy or the contract-laden firm. And you can see immediately, or hopefully you see immediately, how attractive this can be in the nonprofit field, where our social relations are already so important. Our relations with our clients, our relations with our boards. So we're already well embedded in social relationships. And a market transaction might be too hands off. A firm might be too much of a commitment and long-term contract. A network is more nimble. And because, a lot of you are familiar with Dennis's work on resilience, you know how important that nimbleness is, that slack is to resilience, how important that's going to be when there's a lot of uncertainty around. And again, a firm is ossified and works with a specific set of certainties. Market is very loosey-goosey, but the network really is someplace in between. So another way to look at this, and this comes out of work that Woody Powell did on coming up with a theory of networks. And here's a nice way to think about markets at one end of a continuum and hierarchies at another, and then the network is a space in between. So you can see, first of all, the normative basis. And just as I said, contracts are around property rights, and paying somebody for something and getting it back. Hierarchies are all about the employment relation, bringing people in. Networks are about complementary strengths, looking for things that other organizations do that can complement you or that are similar, but in a way that you can build on that. How do you communicate? Market, it's all about prices. This is haggling in the agora. You all have that vision in your head of the Greek agora or a Middle Eastern market, and it's all about haggling. It's 5 shekels, 4 shekels, whatever it takes. In hierarchy, it's all about routines. It's all about standardization. Anybody who's familiar with any of Weber's work on bureaucracy, the rules of hierarchy. Networks are all about relations. Okay, it's all going to be about relations. I'm not going to go through this entire list. You'll have the slides available to you. But what I want to point out as well is flexibility, because this is where the resilience comes in. Markets, very high flexibility, right? You buy something, you don't like it, you never have to buy again from that person, okay? Hierarchy, not very flexible, right? I mean, bringing somebody on costs a lot of money. Detaching them from the organization has costs. As the organization grows, it becomes, again, more and more ossified and harder to change. But what if you want something a little bit more flexible than the hierarchy, but not quite as hands-off as the market? The network is an opportunity to get you medium flexibility. It can work fast at times, but it can also harden and become something you can depend on at others. So, conceptually, it's a sort of, it's the Goldilocks, right? Markets is too high and the hierarchy is too low. Networks is just right, and especially when we're dealing with resilience. So again, more theoretical stuff, but not worth, going into detail here. I just want to, give you an idea of how you can think about markets, how you can think about hierarchies as, a happy medium between the spot markets and the ossified hierarchies. So I just spoke for a long time and I'm tired of talking. And that means that it's time for you guys to think now. So now that I've given you this framework, this notion that there are 3 different buckets to put transactions into, markets, when you want to, this is the buy decision, if you will, in economics. You've got hierarchies, which is the make decision. But now you've got a third thing, which is neither market nor hierarchy. So think about your own organizations. And think about the transactions that you do that are market-like. Which are the ones that are hierarchy-like? And which ones actually might work well through networks? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to jot down some ideas on that. And then I'll call on volunteers to talk about some things you do that are markets, some things you do best as a hierarchy, and some things that might actually work with a network. Okay, so first of all, here's another tool for the network toolkit, if you will. Going back to your organizations, you can actually bring a group of decision makers together and have them do this kind of mind mapping exercise. In fact, I would highly recommend paper and pen. And again, if we were in a room together, I probably would have provided you with markers and large pieces of paper. And I'd actually have you draw different transactions and which ones you had as markets and which ones you had as hierarchies and which ones could be either. So again, this kind of mind mapping is definitely something that that you can use to bring a board into line, thinking about how to network, or an executive team. So anybody want to throw out some market transactions? My organization is just we use a market for this, and we're always going to use a market for this. Roland?
Yeah, if you don't mind if I go, because I'm going to have to step off in a little while. This is great, and it was fun. So I work with I volunteer for a human services organization that does street level direct services, nutrition, housing, but it also has systems activities in advocacy for housing solutions and so forth. So the market activities are, we give away food. It's a market transaction at zero price. So that, to accomplish that, because that's demand. Demand is for nutrition. People expect us to give away food. We give away food. That's a market transaction. Just happens to be where the reservation price for the willingness to pay for the purchaser is below zero. So that's unusual, but that's what's happening. In order to facilitate that, in order to make that possible, we have a firm that does fundraising and administers it, right? So it would not be possible to have a nutrition program at scale without a firm to organize it. It could happen And no doubt it does happen in family and small communities, person to person, but at scale, it needs an administrative structure. However, the problems of nutrition and homelessness and housing are systemic. And so the organization vigorously networks with municipalities and states and this program and that program, Homeless Regional Advisory Board, Lehigh Valley Food Council, and so forth. Because those are the kinds of things that will generate longer term solutions.
Perfect. Anybody else want to jump in with an example of any market, network, or hierarchy transactions that your organization does? Elizabeth?
I think that for all of us in education, I think that there's always going to be tension and discussion over tuitions, marketization, and whether they're students, whether they're clients, and whether they're customers. So I think that's I think that the exchange itself, though there may be subsidization from government or things like that, I think makes this a little bit more complicated, but it is a market transaction. And so we're always going to try, and we're always going to struggle with the tension of what exactly a student is in terms of that transaction.
Elizabeth, you could think that our educational employers, they are actually our agents whose job it is to get students and put them in front of us.
There are schools that were formed on just that basis. The new school originally was formed by faculty who hired administrators to fill their classrooms. So that model is actually pretty old, and some of us wish it would come back, but absolutely. Does anybody else want to jump in, or I can move along and give you even more theory for your toolboxes? All right, I'm gonna move along in the interest of time, but thank you both, Elizabeth and Roland, for great examples. I'm hoping that the examples are making this come alive to everybody in their organizations. I'm about to get a little bit more theoretically heavy, but I'll try to bring it back so that you can actually use this. And that's to introduce you to Ron Burt's structural holes theory. So I know Nara's shaking her head because you can't do research in network seriously and not know Ron Burt. So Ron Burt starts with the notion that, first of all, you can do this at the individual level. So as I'm talking, you can think about you as a networker, you can think about your organization as a networker, or you can think about your community networking. And his theory holds at all three levels. So you or your organization or even your community have three kinds of capital. Okay, one is you have financial capital. And that financial capital, for you, that's your income. For your organization, it's your revenues, it's your investments, it's all the money you can bring to the table. So organizations and individuals have a varied amount of financial capital. You also have human capital. And again, it took a while for economists to sort of get up to speed with this, but they're pretty much on top of the human capital thing. And again, the human capital, you yourself have human capital in terms of your own skills, your educational level, et cetera. And your organization has an aggregate of the human skills and the education and the work experience. And even the community, you can think about the community having certain levels of human capital. What are the educational levels? What are the work experience levels? So those types of capital economists are very used to dealing with. But social scientists have for a long time been talking about social capital. And the network theory really sort of rises and falls on this notion that there's a third type of capital out there that turns out to be very important, and that's social capital. And social capital is your friends, it's your colleagues. It explains why Jody is here sitting with you guys, because I drew on my social capital to get her here. The social capital is all of the folks you're connected with who can give you opportunities. Okay, so opportunities is key, because to use a network, to strategically use a network, you have to be, you're exposing yourself to opportunities that your network will help you get. So how a network is an asset very specifically is that when you think about opportunities and allocating those opportunities, think about it from the person who has that opportunity and who can allocate it. Sometimes you don't need to optimize, just giving that opportunity out is enough. You don't have to find the very best person or organization. You just need a body. Although within a certain range. I mean, and college admissions is, a good example of this. I mean, you can fill a class with students from all over the place, but you usually have some sort of range, lower level limit. But even within the range of people you could give an opportunity to, people may have similar financial and human capital. So if you have a whole bunch of people with similar human and financial capital, who gets the opportunity? How do you narrow down the list? You have to use a factor other than financial capital and human capital, because lots of people have the same amount of that, but you still have that opportunity. This is a question of social capital. Okay, who gets the opportunity given the same amount of human capital and financial capital ultimately comes down to social capital. This is very traditional. You've all heard this. It's not what you know, it's who you know. This is just the theoretical background behind it. Why is who you know so important? Because what you know is easily replicable. Just go to school and raise what you know. Anybody can do that. And of course, that's not true. Not everybody can. There's all kinds of reasons they can't. But in theory, economists think in theoretical terms. So in theory, you need more human capital, go out and get it. Social capital, on the other hand, is something that's not so easily manufactured. That's something you have to strategically work on. And that's what's going to separate out people and organizations in need. So you can think about your network in two ways, according to Bert. You can think about it as the pattern of relations between the units. So, literally if my thumbs are the units, the network are my two fingers connecting it up. You can also think about a network as a whole between my two thumbs. If my two thumbs aren't connected, this is a whole. You know what? For Ron Burt, this whole huge opportunity. This is where our opportunity comes from, where there is no network connection yet. It's the whole. So most people, when we think about our networks, we think about the people we're actually connected to. We think about the visible connections, but opportunities come to us through the holes, through the places we haven't made those connections yet. This is true for individuals. This is true for organizations. This is true for communities. And again, everything in Bert's theory is true at all three of those levels. So how is a network an asset? Obvious benefits, referrals, right? Your networks will refer you to other people. Access, your networks will get you, and because your connections will connect you to other people where there's currently a hole, right? Networks give you information. What we're going to talk about throughout is that ultimately why we're all here today is networks provide resilience. And the central theme in all of this is opportunity, because that's where networks come in. They bring you opportunity. So how is a network an opportunity, an asset? Well, you need a certain kind of network, and you need your network to have certain kinds of factors attached to it. And there's some variables around that. So velocity is a key variable. How fast does your information get your network? Your network may be filled with information, but if it takes forever to get that information from one end of the network to your end, you lost the opportunity. So velocity is going to be something that you want to be aware of in forming networks. Trust. Again, there's a lot of information floating around out there, and social media, my God, can you trust the information? So you want a network high in trust, otherwise that information is garbage. Size, this is a little tricky. I mean, if everything else is equal, bigger is probably better, but there's reasons where that may not be the case. You need to think about diversity here, because if you've got a big network that leads you to all the same places, it's not worth it to you. I'll show you mathematically. Well, I'll show you in a picture how that works. Diversity is going to be key. So what matters is not the absolute number of contacts, but non-redundant contacts. Okay, so two contacts are redundant if they lead you to the same unit. And again, this is a lot of words. I promise you I'm going to have, because pictures are worth 1,000 words, I'm going to have pictures that are going to catch you up with me. Okay, so just let this stuff flow over you and then we'll get to the pictures. Some of you may be familiar with Mark Granovetter's work on the strength of weak ties. Okay, so BERT is really dependent on this notion because in your network, it's not those really strong ties that are going to lead you to new and exciting places, but it's really the weaker ties. When two contacts are non-redundant, they can be seen as connected by a structural hole. And remember, it's the holes that we're going to be concerned about here, because it's the holes that determine social capital. So the number of holes in a network can be expected to increase with the network size. The more people you have, the more people that they're connected to that you don't have connections to. But it's the volume of holes rather than the contacts itself that determine the social capital. Okay, so you want a big network because you want access to more holes, because it's through those holes that the opportunities are going to come. Get to the picture already, Ricky. That's just, I'm having trouble here with all of this. Here's a cute little picture, okay? So we start with A and A prime, okay? Network, same thing, okay? You've got 4 contacts. You want to build a network, all right? So network B and network B prime show you 2 different ways to build your network. Notice that in both networks, you are somehow or another connected to the same 8 dots or nodes. But in network B, you're double connected. In network B prime, you're only using one connection and using the node to get to the second connection. You're connected to the same number of people, but not through your direct ties. Right? So you see that there are 8 lines in network B, but only 4 in network B prime. And yet you're still aware of opportunities through 8 people in both of those networks. Multiply that further out to network C and network C prime, and you can see clearly that in both cases, you have access to 16 different nodes. But in network C, you're putting time and energy into maintaining 16 direct ties, whereas in network C prime, you're only putting time and energy into 4 direct contacts, but those contacts themselves are connecting you to 3 other people. So you've got access to the same 16, but in network C, every place you see a line is time, perhaps money, energy on your part. And you can see the difference, how much more time, money, and energy is going into maintaining network C and maintaining network C prime.
Ricky,
yeah.
Ricky, doesn't that assume that there's no sort of friction or loss of relationships, right? It's more efficient if the relationship content is kind of commodity level and can't deteriorate.
Absolutely, Roland, and that's going to be my punchline in the end, of course. Yes, absolutely. No, that's fine. That's absolutely. This is network theory completely stripped of any kind of affect or sentiment or the real relations. This is just network theory for an economist who's only interested in opportunity and efficiency. But yes, you're right. It's not going to be this stark. This is just to illustrate that
it's a theoretical possibility.
Absolutely. With a quarter of the effort in network C, you could get to the same number of people by using C prime. Yeah. This is strictly.
Ricky, if I could just say from the vantage point that I'm at, when I look at my non-for-profits, when I'm dealing with programming, this is perfect. But if I'm talking about fundraising, absolutely, you do not want to have that kind of relationship with your donors. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the key to this. Once you have this theoretical concept, it's where you apply it. So, and you don't apply it everywhere. Even an economist doesn't apply it everywhere, but depending upon how calculating you are and time is a resource, right? And one of the things we're going to bring out is network maintenance requires time. You got to put time in. You got to check in with your networks. It could be wonderful. It could be well worth your time, but it's still time you're not doing other things. Dennis.
In this era of problems with supply chains, I was wondering whether you're going to work in the notion of bottlenecks. So like if I look between C and C prime, it's really important to figure out which of those people in the different clusters that I connect to. Because if one turns out to be not very reliable, then I lose the whole cluster.
Absolutely. And this is the redundancy argument. Again, the good news about C prime is there's not a lot of redundancy. That's exactly the bad news about C prime as well. C prime works really well in an environment of munificence, again, where time is money, blah, blah, blah. But there's going to be a trade-off. There's an absolute trade-off between how much time you have to maintain the network versus, again, does your network have the velocity, the information, the trust that you need? Because if it doesn't, even one tie to that network is probably misplaced, and you're better off having two ties to a different network that's got more trust, velocity, and less bottleneck. Yeah, absolutely. This is basically the same picture, just jumbled and looking ugly. But the main thing to take away from it is there's a before and an after. And you're seeing a very dense network in the before, and you're seeing the same number of nodes connected in a much more diverse network in the after. It's the same drawing as before, except spatially, they want to show you what it looked like another way. So again, in both the networks, in the last one I showed you, in both the networks, you're maintaining 5 relationships. But again, and this goes back to the redundancy part, in the dense network, each relationship that you maintain puts you into contact with the same units you reached through other relationships. So you only have one non-redundant contact, and the other 4 are redundant with the first. So in a sparse network, you get one non-redundant contact for each one of your contacts. And again, this is a purely an efficiency argument, and how to use your time. But there are some benefits to the sparse network in terms of knowledge, in terms of getting yourself spread out to other knowledge groups. So again, Dennis, we'll forget about the bottlenecks for now. We'll just think just in terms of assuming great flow of information, velocity, trust, you're going to get more information overall from a denser network. Excuse me, from a sparse network. The thing with a dense network is the contagion, because everybody's closely connected with each other, it sort of implies a similarity of assets and skills as well. And especially in a time of resilience, you might not need those same similar skills and assets that you have. You might need to connect up to nodes that have different skills and different assets. And the sparse network allows you the time to get to other pieces of information out there in other networks. So the sparse network is going to funnel information from 5 separate areas. So again, it's the diversity that you can get. And this does not, help you if one of those is faulty. But in some, the dense, and again, this is economist speak, right? The dense network is an inefficient use of your time. You may want to optimize something other than efficiency, but if efficiency is what you're after, a dense network, and Jody, again, in fundraising, this is probably not the way to go, but maybe in program development, it is. But basically, you're maintaining 5 relationships for a return of only one non-redundant contact. Okay, so this, again, I'm just giving you the words to show you that very first picture with C and C prime.
So network efficiency actually ends up contradicting the natural process by which networks expand. And this is why this is a strategy, because you kind of have to fight against it. It's a lot easier to meet friends of friends and then form bonds with both your friend and your friend of friend. That's the way networks usually work. Friends introduce you to other friends, and the same factors that make your friends attractive make their friends attractive to you. So again, you're getting that redundancy, which for Slack purposes is good, but for efficiency purposes is terrible. The networks of similar people are easy, they're comfortable, they're pretty low maintenance, but the fatter that network gets, the less efficient that network is. When I talk about Ron Burt with my students, and where I'll end this, is when I explain to them that if you're thinking about efficiency, there is absolutely no reason to be in touch with both your mom and your dad. They are completely redundant contacts in your network. If you're going to be efficient, determine which one, and they'll get you in touch with the other. And that sort of brings home, again, Jody, you're not going to do that, but if you were truly optimizing efficiency and you wanted the most opportunities through your network, any kind of redundant contact, you don't need it. Just keep to one and let that one connect you to the other. So that's the theory behind it, okay? And again, in practice, the key is figuring out when that's useful. And I think, Jody, you had a great notion with fundraising, probably the worst use of this network. But if you're looking for grant opportunities or something like that, that may be a place you can use this. And when you're in a crisis mode and your network is facing the same crisis you are, the sparser your network, the more leads you have to outside of the crisis, that's where the network's going to pay off. And that's what we saw during 9/11, because when the networks were all very local, well, it was Chinatown that was devastated. And if all of your contacts were only in Chinatown, your contacts couldn't help you. They couldn't provide the resilience you needed to overcome the tragedy of 9/11. You needed a sparser network that led you outside of Chinatown so you could get resources from other places. Dennis, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, how the thinking has evolved as technology has made contact so much cheaper. I mean, it's interesting that, I'm old enough to remember that if you wanted to build a network, you had to use the telephone and write letters. And now, you could send an email message to 100 people at the same time, and it's very, very cheap. So I'm thinking that as technology has evolved, it becomes less imperative to winnow down your network, because you can really just kind of contact everybody at once. I mean, there's a downside, obviously, because people ignore mass emails, and so personalizing it does help. But
Right. And, that's an issue of trust. So you're absolutely right. Velocity is much less of an issue now. Trust is even more of an issue now, though.
yeah.
And what you talked about is a one-way interaction. If you sent out a mass email to 1,000 people, if 1,000 people wrote you back, all right, you'd have to be sifting through, that's going to be time to sift through that 1,000 people. And a lot of them are not going to be the trusted, I wanted to say quality, but that's problematic. But, in other words, not all of those 1,000 people are it's not going to be as valuable to you to hear from all that. And that's where the trade-off is. If you have if you blast to 1,000 people, that's a direct contact. If 1,000 people blast back to you, that's 1,000 direct contacts you have to, if nothing else, sift through, right? And that's time consuming. And your time might be better spent chasing somebody who's not in your network, but who's in another network that has access to other opportunities and other resources. So again, this is the theory behind it. And I love the idea that we're really talking about when to apply it and when not to apply it, because I think, that's going to be the key to all of this. But I want to talk specifically now about the networks and the network opportunities that are open to nonprofit organizations. Because this, you can use this BERT stuff literally. I mean, I tell my students, you know, you can use it for job searches. In fact, you should use it for job searches. This is really where this is useful. It's very useful as an individual. Even dating, it's probably not, I mean, it's not that far from eHarmony if you think about it. So, you know, these principles can be useful. Theoretically for your life and for your organization, but you know, specifically for nonprofit organizations, here I'm really going to call on Dennis because I'm going to draw on you know, some of the really great work that he did to kind of establish this field of study, and that's, you know, the question of why nonprofits network, if you will, but very specifically network in, you know, what are federations or a franchise type. And there are going to be some terms here that I'm going to slip on. So Dennis, you're going to have to correct me in places, and we can actually debate whether, you know, how clearly we want to keep these boundaries, because it does get, there's a lot of overlap here. But so a federation or a franchise is a structural relation between organizations. And Jody, later you can talk to us about Horizons and the structural relationship that has with its host institutions. So back in 1989, which, you know, for those of you doing counting, is not that many years after Williamson won his Nobel Prize for determining that there were firms. But back in 1989, our Dennis noted that a lot of national voluntary associations were actually evolving towards franchise-like systems. Or federated national movements. And Dennis contrasted that with a trade association model or with a corporate model. So, you know, specifically when he, and Dennis, please jump in when I'm wrong here, okay? But so just to have these models in your head, when we're talking about the federated national movements, we're talking about like the YMCA. We're talking about the Boy Scouts. That's the kind of model in our head for that. When we're talking about trade associations, which have a lot of similar things, except there's this quid pro quo exchange of services. You know, you sort of, you know, you pay a fee and you get services directly. It's not, that's a different model from YMCA and Boy Scouts. That model, the trade association model, that's more like the American Hospital Association, the American Association of Museums. Stuart, you can tell us where NCNE fits into all of these. You know, it's got some factors that could put it into a number of these categories. And you can contrast that federation model, that trade association model, and with a third model, which is a more corporate model, which is where there's where unitary national organizational entities have regional like local branches. So you can think of the American Red Cross in that term, or the March of Dimes. Dennis, have I mangled that terribly?
No, you've done great. Great.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, good. So according to Myers-Zoll, the federated structure is one in which the central body is actually controlled by the units. And the units enter into that voluntarily. They make a larger association. So this is, you know, this is more sort of grassroots or up from the local level to form that federated function. So, you know, these are not new concepts. You know, even though Ron Burt's structural wholes is you know, from the 80s and 90s, nonprofits have been doing this kind of thing basically, you know, from the beginning of their incorporation. Certainly in the United States, we've seen the federated model, the trade association model, and the corporate model. And these are all basically network type models that nonprofits engage in. Sorry, I'm moving my screen around because I have lost my arrow. Okay, here we go. So what forces, if you will, what are the forces that propel nonprofits to federate, to, you know, rise up from the grassroots and the local level to have some sort of centralized or national presence? And Dennis, I'm assuming this is cribbed from your work on this.
Okay.
So, you know, help me where I need help here. But So, certainly we've seen the increase of this, as Dennis noted as late as 1989, with the mobility of Americans. And in a lot of ways, this is not different from the McDonald's franchise model. You used to, your local YMCA, you move to a new town, where my YMCA at, right? So, Americans moving around has really helped this model spread, this idea that you want something similar wherever you are newly located. Then there's so that's a driving force, so the actual mobility of the folks served. But then there's also an interdependence, and especially organizations using the same name want to make sure that there's some sort of consistency, reputational consistency. So there's calls for a national to promulgate standards for an organization. Our problems are global. Well, they're certainly global, but at least on a smaller scale, they're nationwide. Nonprofits, are largely mission driven to deal with grand challenges. Some of those are local, but a lot of those are national. Another good reason for nonprofits to federate at a national level, because that's where we need to solve a lot of problems. The economy is national. The polity is national. Again, not completely, but as that increases, the need for nonprofits to federate nationally increases. And national networks competing with each other necessitate natural centralized strategies for these organizations. So, the YMCA competes with other national networks. They need a national strategy to help their locals be able to compete. So, this is just some of the driving forces historically behind network franchising. And of course, as you're sitting here thinking about your own organization and whether federation is something that will fit well as part of your strategy, you can think about how these driving forces are actually impacting your own organization and whether a federation strategy makes sense given that. So another way to look at why nonprofits federate or franchise comes from yet another economist, and Nara's smiling because she's run into this as well. So Yale economist Sharon Oster, when she started looking at nonprofits, she was also fascinated by the whole franchise or federation model. And what I like about the way she does this is she sort of assumes that network theory that I started this off with by suggesting that the franchise model is sort of a halfway house between the freestanding entrepreneurial enterprise with local autonomy and the branch office with centralized control. So in a lot of ways, this is similar to market versus firm, and that franchise is basically the network, which is supposed to be the not too hot, not too cold, but the perfect medium between more flexibility, more autonomy, but the perfect in-between state. And Sharon Oster said that the federation model, and again, in a lot of this, you can just think in general, this is a network model. It helps you to deal with 4 characteristics specifically of nonprofit management. So it's very valuable in the nonprofit space specifically, given the kind of product or service that we produce. And especially around the fact that information about that product is not easily attainable and accessible by the consumer. The dependence of nonprofits on fundraising it is also a characteristic that helps lead to a national strategy. Inadequate access of nonprofits to capital. Again, federating helps you get at monies that you can't if you're staying just at the local level. And the fact that there's also an absence of quantitative criteria for managerial performance at the local level, and a federation can help give you consistent standards to use. So again, all reasons that this form is particularly helpful in the nonprofit arena. I need to move my screen so I have more access to there we go. Okay, that's a little bit better. So the characteristics that lead to this franchising, again, the unobservability of the product, where reputation becomes a strategic asset, and the more that's localized and consistent, again, a McDonald's is a McDonald's anywhere. A YMCA conjures up certain things that we expect no matter where we are. Fundraising for similar purpose is akin to tragedy of the commons. So are you guys familiar with the notion of the tragedy of the commons from economics? Some of you are, some of you aren't. But it's basically the idea that if everybody's going after the same free resource, like, literally cows grazing on a field, if there are no rules around that, the cows are going to overgraze and nobody's going to have access to that asset over time. So it's literally the tragedy of the commons. If everybody shares something, eventually they're going to use it up. So you can think about fundraising like that as well, that if everybody's going after the donors, eventually they're going to suck those donors dry. So you would need some kind of strategy to help determine, who goes to fundraisers at what time. I mean, I know in my university, any fundraising we do, we have to get that cleared through central, because God forbid we step on somebody else's toes and go after the same donor as somebody else, they go crazy. So, again, you need a centralized strategy to help so that not everybody's, feeding off all the same donors. Again, the access to the capital is constrained at the local level, but the federation gives you more access to capital. So this notion that turning nonprofit managers into franchise owners reduces the need to monitor them, because they have the rules and regulations set out from central about what a good local looks like, and that gives you a framework to evaluate managers. I've got to keep moving around and lose my arrow here. Here we go. Okay. So back as early as 1995, and this one blew my mind when I was looking at this again. 1 million nonprofits in the United States, out of 1 million nonprofits in the United States, Oster claimed that a large majority of those were affiliates of national nonprofits. So that blew my mind. Like, that 1 million organizations, and most of them are actually parts of federations. But if you think about it, even back in 1999, Planned Parenthood alone had 171 affiliates. The United Way had 2,300 affiliates. Ducks Unlimited has, I don't even know the number. I mean, thousands of affiliates. You start adding those affiliates up, that's how you get to 1 million nonprofits really quickly. So, at least for me, and this is, not, obviously not true for Dennis, who's been working in this field forever. And Jody, the Horizons at Foot example, you're not used to this either, but, I tend to think of nonprofits as very local, very idiosyncratic, very tied to their local communities. But the majority of our, now we're probably close to 2 million nonprofits in the US. I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but the majority of those are actually part of these federations or franchises, and they're actually already networked in that sense. We're going to be talking to Kim Ayuzi later in the afternoon from Dress for Success. Another example of an organization with, adding hundreds of nonprofit organizations to our total, but they're all part of this federated structure. For Oster, there are so many nonprofits because nationals need to provide service on the local level. So she's looking at it the other way. We keep on growing this 1 million to 2 million because now that we have these nationals, they're placing locals in all the areas which are not currently served. And they need those locals because that's a much better way to get volunteers. That may or may not help you with the fundraising, although it certainly helps in some aspects of the fundraising. You're not going to get the volunteers on the national level the way you can when you've got boots on the ground locally. National operations invest in system-wide activities, certainly the reputation. I mean, that's key. You know what you're going to get when you join the Girl Scouts in one town if you were a Girl Scout in another town. The nationals create administrative procedures and systems, but the local affiliates conduct the operational work. Okay, so I'm going to put this into play with a illustrative case example. But before I do, questions about franchising and federation, because we've got the expert right here in the room. And so any question you have, I want you to ask Dennis because I know the answer. All right, Dennis, ask and answer your own question about nonprofit federations.
Well, one of the, I guess it relates to resilience in a sort of way, because one of the problems with these networks, and I don't know how common it is, but when the central organization, when headquarters kind of goes off the rails or something happens, that at the central office, I think, that reflects on the whole system, then we have real problems. And it's sort of interesting to see how that works. I mean, I think of the classic
United Way,
United Way, Boy Scouts,
Komen, Boy Scouts, absolutely.
Yeah, Oxfam.
Yep.
I even think of American Cancer. That's an interesting one. Not that they had a scandal, but they have, like other federations in the health charities area, they've really moved towards centralization. And well, even in the Girl Scouts, they're consolidating local councils, and they're trying to move more toward a corporate model. And it's an interesting question, because they lose a lot when they do that. They lose that kind of local social capital that you were talking about. They lose some ability, I think, to fundraise at the local level, but they gain economies of scale and they gain more control. So I think with these kinds of networks, we really have to think about governance and how a strong central unit can be a problem.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of, if there's a scandal at a local, how does the national sort of cut that off or keep that isolated so it doesn't spread up the network to the central and then back out to the nodes? And again, this is all the reasons why networks need maintenance. You can't just set them up. They have to be actively managed. And back from the efficiency perspective, why, if you're managing too many, it gets to be very time consuming. So it's all an issue of finding the happy medium, because the whole network concept, really going back to Powell's work and Bert's work, the network is there's tension. Right, there's tension between the pull of the local and the autonomous, and the pull of the central. It's the same pull between spot market buying or forming a firm. The network is the perfect happy medium, but that doesn't mean that it's always perfect in all situations. And figuring out where to deploy the network, and where the network should ossify into a hierarchy or completely dissolve into local autonomous spot markets, is a question of strategy. And it's, sometimes the network reins have to be held tight, and sometimes they need to be given space. And this is why experience with it and practice and case studies are so important, to figure out, your organization, which one are you like, and how did that organization handle its network crisis? And that's why I'm really excited about, the panel and the case study, because we'll have more organizations to look at and see how they deal with these very real tensions that come from networks. And again, I started out, network is, it's the perfect porridge, it's the best thing since sliced bread, except when it's not. But where it can be really helpful is again, the resilience, which is why we're talking about it, in this session. And that brings me back to crisis, because some of you will remember this well. I think most of you will. I talk to my students, and I know for a fact that this image means very little to my students, or I shouldn't say it means very little, but it means very different things to my students as it means to me. just to give you some sense, this view that you have, okay, from where I was this day, this view was this is like a far away view compared to where I was when this was happening. I mean, when this was happening, let's see, where am I? I was, somewhere right about, in here. Oops. Let me go back to that. I was viewing this from trying to remember now. I think it was certainly within a mile. So it hit me, in a very personal way. I mean, thankfully, I wasn't in the buildings, although of course, being in New York at the time, I knew people who were. But I didn't have debris fall on me. So, I'm not suggesting that, I was that close, but I was close enough. And Jody probably remembers this, that, I was on the phone with her from under my bed, literally, because I was, halfway between that and the Empire State Building, which for all I knew was another target and was also going to fall down, but this time on me. I was struggling to find some sense of normalcy outside of my local area, because this was my local network right here, burning in front of me. I needed personally ties outside of that geographic locality to know that, oh, kids are still in school, life is normal somewhere else, because life in New York, and especially life in downtown New York, ceased to exist as we knew it, both, alas, physically for thousands of people, but, for all of the organizations around there as well. After a couple of weeks and things opened up enough for me to get to my office and that kind of thing, I was at the New School at that point, in the nonprofit management program. And we were worried about our friends and relatives, but we then took the next step out and we were worried about our organizations. We were worried about the organizations in New York City, how are they doing? Some were physically destroyed. People died, clients died, staff died. You talk about supply chain issues, there was nothing getting to ground zero or, a good mile around it for months. After this, and at that point, I was at the New School, so we were right in the center of it. So my entire stakeholder network was involved in this, and we wanted to find out how we could help and what the organizations needed. That was key. What did our organizations need, which prompted the research that I'll go into. But first, why is that relevant here? Because COVID-19 as a disaster shares, a number of characteristics with what I was dealing with, personally on 9/11, but as well, there's a future of crises ahead of us, whether we like to think about it or not. So what we can learn from one crisis, we might be able to bring into the next and be better prepared. And this is where networks really play a role. So you can think about crises and, therefore resilience, in terms of a number of variables that separate out one crisis for the other and might call for different kinds of network structures. So the impact of the tragedy, what's the velocity with which the impact hit? 9/11, obviously, instantaneous. COVID, depending on where you were, was instantaneous. I mean, again, I currently live in Bergen County, so the very first case of COVID-19 on the East Coast was a Bergen County resident. Somehow or other, I end up being right wherever ground zero is for all of these things, but whatever. So, Bergen County gets hit immediately. I'm sensing it probably took Cleveland a good month or so after New Jersey before you started to see the impact of COVID. Dallas, probably a little bit longer than that. So, one of the issues is how fast this hits. Cleveland and Dallas, you had a little bit of a head start in at least thinking about whether you use that or not, but at least you kind of knew what was coming down the pike. Bergen County, we were looking at Italy for examples of how to handle this because we didn't have anything in the United States. In thinking about how well a network can help you be resilient. So, velocity, how quick this comes at you, the severity. 9/11, the severity was really, really harsh. The closer you were to the trade center, as we expanded out, the severity lessened quite a bit, to the point where when we were talking to nonprofit organizations in the Bronx, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with New York geography, but the Bronx is an outer borough. They could see, some of the clouds coming over, but most people probably didn't even have direct view of the trade center. We went out, we asked organizational leaders there about the impact of 9/11, and I specifically remember talking to one human resource provider and looked at me and said, something, my kids live in poverty every day, and 9/11 was just one more day in poverty for them. It was across the river. It might have as well have been across the ocean. This is not the problem we're dealing with now. I got kids who aren't eating. I got to deal with them on a day-to-day basis. So severity can depend upon the location of the crisis and how widespread it is. 9/11, again, it impacted all of our heads, but in terms of nonprofit organizations, the ones right in the shadow, even in New York City, were the ones that were more directly impacted. My nonprofits in the Bronx had issues with 9/11 because supply chains were a little slower and they had problems getting to the government, but their service population had been affected by other things long before and long after 9/11, and it wasn't all that disruptive in that sense. That being said, when you were right in the center of it, the impact was impervious to age, to budget, to funding. It didn't matter if you were a small local in Chinatown or if you were the United Way serving Chinatown. You were immediately impacted. Again, that may or may not be translatable to the COVID-19 situation or to future crises and disasters. As the tragedy unfolds unevenly, the recovery unfolds unevenly as well. What we found over and over when we went to nonprofits in New York City, the larger nonprofit organizations had larger safety nets. And in this case, when I say safety net, it's really short for safety network. Okay, that's the resilience. Okay, a safety net ultimately is a network, just as a net itself is a network. A safety net is a network, okay? The needs in crisis may not match your organizational resources. This is the make or buy decision, okay? Right? Your organization gets walloped, gets hit by something. You don't have the internal resources. That firm, that hierarchy has failed. The spot market may fail, supply chains and whatnot. That safety net is what's going to get you out of that crisis. That safety network is going to give you an alternative between your hierarchy, which has failed, and the spot market, which may have failed. That network has that resilience right in it. So the key to recovery, networks. What do you get from your networks? What resilience does your network afford you that, again, your hierarchy and your spot market doesn't? Perhaps money or funding. Money can become instantly available through your central organization, through a funder, through an organization with more resources that's not currently using them because they're not hit by the crisis. Who gets the monies that are available? Who's networked? Do you have that opportunity? Funding, sometimes, people will raise. I remember it clearly with 9/11. I think we did it with COVID as well. Telethons and all kinds of massive fundraising concerts and stuff like that. So the money comes in. Who gets the money? All right, that's where your network comes into play, because we know networks are opportunities, and the network can attach you to the monies that become available when when Farm Aid does its thing, when all the 9/11, there were a bunch of different telethons for New York City. I can't remember, but I'm sure we had those for COVID as well. I kind of remember donating to some COVID relief funds
It was
as
a
well.
New Jersey one with Springsteen and Bon Jovi and Adam Schlesinger.
I should have remembered that. Yes, of course. Yeah, New Jersey keeps on getting hit by crises. So we need our musicians to jump to the fore. But again, who gets those monies? The people who network. And in fact, during the panel, we're going to bring on Linda Zippo, who is the executive director of the Center for Nonprofits in New Jersey. So she is a network hub in New Jersey, and maybe we can ask her if she did any work with Springsteen and with Bon Jovi about getting those money out to the organizations. So what else does that network provide you in a crisis? How else does that network give you resilience? So if you have an umbrella or even an intermediary organization, even without that hierarchy, but just a node that has more knowledge, those organizations can send out communiques, information, important links to their organizational network. They can help them assess the damage and assess the need. I mean, even when I went out to talk to nonprofits in New York, I still needed a network to figure out who to talk to. If I didn't have a network to your organization, I didn't even know you were out there to be able to talk to you to do a needs assessment after 9/11. A network can help assure that communication can be used to match client demand to organizational supply. And again, here's where the network concept is so powerful, because one node all the way over here may not be immediately affected by a disaster, but may have some slack resources. Whereas the node in the center of the crisis may need those resources, doesn't have them, but if they have a link to the organization that has the resources, we can better match resources up with need in a crisis through that networking experience. Non-affiliation, and we saw this in 9/11. Those organizations we could even find who weren't networked, there were risks associated with that. In the short term, they couldn't get recovery resources because they didn't even know who to ask or where to go. Okay, they couldn't get funding, they couldn't get extra staffing because they only knew their very local neighborhood, which itself was devastated. So their operations came to a grinding halt because they didn't have connections to networks where there wasn't that kind of impact. So the short term, you immediately saw these organizations were paralyzed. On the longer term, once they got past the initial grief, they had limited contract and supplier negotiations, limited knowledge sharing, limited leverage, limited advocacy, because they weren't connected to either a federated structure or a more organic network structure locally. So, again, what you're taking away from this session, if nothing else, your network helps you so that you don't have to face a crisis alone. The resilience comes from having people in place where they can see more clearly. I tell this story, the night of 9/11, my younger daughter had an asthma attack. The first one she'd had, she was 4. She was out playing that day, and all the chemicals and stuff. I wasn't thinking, literally, I was under the bed. My husband had her out playing. She had an asthma attack at 4 a.m. She came into us, I can't breathe. We didn't know what to do. On any normal day, the answer was easy, get the kid to a hospital. We were literally in walking distance of hospitals at the time. But in the middle of that crisis, with no information coming at me, I didn't even want to take her to the hospital because I figured it would be filled with victims from 9/11. And what are they going to do, with this poor little girl who just has an asthma attack when there are people dying around you? I didn't know what to do. At 4 a.m, I called my insurance company, hoping that I was going to get a call center in India, and a nurse there would not be in the middle of this crisis and could talk to me from a calmer, more sensible place and get her advice. So 4 a.m, I called India and said, I've got a kid here with asthma. She can't breathe. What do I do? I'm in the middle of 9/11. There's ambulances all around me. And the nurse said, get that kid to a hospital, lady. Just get that kid to a hospital, which is what we did. The irony, the sad irony was the hospital was empty because with 9/11, people died immediately or they got out. You know, there just weren't that many injuries that required the hospitalization. So my daughter went to the hospital. They gave her an inhaler. She was fine. The city was devastated. Fine. And then I moved out of New York because I freaked out. But that's a whole different story. The point being, even in that crisis, I used a personal network that got me way the hell out of the crisis so that I could find an organization with resources to tell me what to do. And that model, you can think about that writ large for organizations as well. The more social capital you have, the more structural holes you have in your network, the more access you're going to have to resources if your local network gets devastated by a crisis, and therefore the more resilience you will have in the long term. All right. So I've got some strategies for you for a half an hour strategies, and then you have to break because this is just too much stuff. But before I get to strategies, questions, concerns? I've overwhelmed you all. Okay. All right, so let's talk about some other strategies. So I've given you a lot of theory. I've given you some examples. Now let's talk some more brass tacks. Again, more tools to fill up the resilience toolkit. Drawing on what we know and what we specifically can use. So research from Way, Skillern, and Marciano from 2008. This comes from the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So they were interested in this networked nonprofit concept. And you know, when can an organization call itself a networked nonprofit, and what does it get from that? So they used 3 case studies. They looked at the Habitat for Humanity of Egypt. They looked at guide dogs for the blind, and they looked at the Microfinance Institute of Women's World Banking. And they called these 3, so they were sampling on a dependent variable, but they found 3 network nonprofits that they thought were working really well as such, to study them to see what was common amongst successful network nonprofits. So what was the secret sauce they found by looking at these 3 network nonprofits? And so this is going to bring us to a slightly different mental space thinking about this. With all 3 of these examples, they noticed that, and especially they use the Habitat for Humanity one as an example, these organizations actually replaced their internal focus, their focus on fundraising, staffing, and program development. They replaced that mental map with an external focus that primarily put building their network as a key organizational goal. So they didn't do this completely. I mean, they didn't forget about fundraising and staffing, but they just shifted their priorities a little to make networking an actual organizational goal. According to the case study by Way, Skillern, and Marciano, by mobilizing these outside resources, these network nonprofits were actually able to achieve their missions more effectively, efficiently, and sustainably. There's a little slippage here, because what Way, Skillern, and Marciano were interested in measuring was not organizational efficiency, was not organizational growth or revenue growth. It was actually mission fulfillment. And at least in their 3 examples, they saw that with these 3 organizations, the more they focused outwardly on building the network, the more they were able to actually achieve their mission. And their missions were broad and more community-based. And they found that the more organizations they could bring into that, the more effective they were with an outward-facing mission. Now, I'm thinking, schools may be a slightly different case in this situation. You notice there are no schools and they're highly networked nonprofit, because the good that a nonprofit school produces is less immediately global. There's certainly global impacts for an educated citizenry, but it's a different mission from alleviating poverty in an area, for instance. So schools might have a harder time relinquishing an internal focus for an external focus. But depending upon the mission that your organization is trying to achieve, doing that with more organizations on board might help you get to that more effective, more efficient, more sustainable mission achievement. You know, and this is again different from a traditional nonprofit. And again, the schools might fit into this more because a lot of traditional nonprofits, and now I'm really talking about most nonprofits other than these, you know, super network ones. A lot of nonprofits do have short-term partnerships. In fact, I'm willing to bet that everybody sitting here can think of a partnership that your organization has undertaken on the short term, but sometimes superficially, and oftentimes with an organization that's very similar to what you're doing. There are program exchanges, there are exchanges to access resources and attract funding. So a lot of nonprofits are used to partnering on the small term, but to get to that point where you're a network nonprofit, and now again, this is Way Skillern and Marciano, then you're talking about forging long-term partnerships. So not just you know, program length partnerships, but sustainable organizational level, organization timeframe partnerships with trusted peers. And for them, what's really important, and this, again, we're building on the stuff we started with, moving from hub to node, okay? And to move from hub to node, and I'll show you a picture of that, because again, just words. What they say is if you want to really be a network nonprofit, for resilience, especially around your mission, you need to put your mission at the center of what you do as opposed to the operations. And this is you know, kind of a mind-blowing thing for nonprofit management. I mean, I taught nonprofit management for years. I'd like to think I taught, you know, mission first, but really I talked, you know, we were teaching about operations. You know, we had courses in human resources. We had courses in financial planning and budgeting. We didn't have a course in mission. You know, we didn't have a course in mission fulfillment. So this is definitely, you know, a mind switch, forsaking some control over program implementation, funding, and recognition to actually achieve more mission impact. This is not for everybody. This is really at the far reaches of the network nonprofit. Useful for resilience in that broad, longer term, but again, you have to be sharing missions to be able to pull this off. And, you know, according to Way Skillern and Marciano, the trusted peers come from sharing the same values, and it's really sharing the same mission. If you share the same mission with another organization, you may be able to give up some control, but you're going to have to commit time and resources at the outset to ensure that you're on that common ground. And there's an investment in strengthening the shared values and monitoring your adherence to them. So this is not cost-free, this super nonprofit networking. You also have to demonstrate your commitment to the network rather than growing your own organization. This is not something that all nonprofits can do. But if you do it, this is what they're suggesting. In this case, it's not the density of the ties they're interested in, it's the direction. So they're suggesting, again, do this, not this. So the left-hand side over here, this is your networked nonprofit, which has a lot of dense ties. This is your traditional nonprofit, but notice that you're trying to be the hub here. And this is what they're really trying to get at. For a truly networked nonprofit with a mission that is broader than one organization can handle, okay? And this is, again, this is not for all nonprofits, but for a nonprofit with a mission that's broader than it itself can handle, this is not an effective way to get towards mission. This, however, if all of these organizations share the same mission, this is the way that the community is going to be able to accomplish the mission, the shared mission of all of these organizations. Okay. If you follow in this path for mission fulfillment, this goes against the network efficiency rules, but you want unrestricted and frequent communication between the different nodes. And that will give you the better positioning for a holistic, coordinated, and realistic solution to social issues. So again, you could see that if a tragedy or a pandemic or a crisis hits, it might be worth being a network nonprofit through that tragedy. And then perhaps after getting through that point, after being resilient through that point, then you can start to bring back in your more central focus and maintain your broader network using more efficient nonprofit networking strategies. So again, this is a timing thing. When do you want to be a network nonprofit? Well, in the middle of a tragedy, that density is going to probably be important. Again, as long as that density isn't solely local, because if the crisis is solely local, you're not going to be able to get out of it with the resources that are all constrained. So I'm having you hold a bunch of contradictory notions in your head through this. So, if there are questions, let's work through them together.
I had an aha here. You just explained something that I've struggled with for years here. So it's very difficult to break into a network, much easier when you're there at the start. And now I guess I see why. So there's a truism to what you just described with those two diagrams that I think the people in the networks recognize them, but the people outside the networks don't. And advantages are to the people in it, and disadvantages are the people not in it, or the organizations not in it. So, I mean, on the one hand, I understand it because this is how you create a system of service. On the other hand, it's not that it has to be democratic, but it doesn't. The access to it's so limited.
Absolutely. That's why we need to talk about how to form a network. That's exactly right. And how to form a diverse network. Because again, what we know with the interlocking directorates is it's very easy to tap your friends and people who look like you and bring them into your network. Right. But it's not at all clear that that's helpful to you or your network. And it's certainly not helpful to the folks outside of your network.
There's like a conspiracy of silence too. It's not like people talk about this stuff. It's you have to pick up on the signals in your organization. And, a signal is, I don't know if it's permanent, but very difficult to change.
Absolutely. Dennis, did you want to add something?
Yeah. Could you put the diagram back on? And, I just thinking how the diagram helps to understand or illuminate the United Way crisis in the 90s, because what was happening is that you had United Ways all around the country, and and very a very sort of weak center, that didn't have these strong arrows on the left. I don't know that the United Ways talked to one another very much. They were pretty much independent, and they grew by copying. One city would copy another in terms of how you got there. And so we had all these United Ways all over the country. So the argument was we need to make this whole movement stronger, particularly as the economy was changing and the United Ways were having more and more trouble raising money, because it was easier to have a relationship with a big corporation. But if if the economy was moving more towards small business, which it was, then it changes the whole thing. So there was an argument to strengthen and build United Way of America, which is on the right side of there. And in some ways it became, pretty effective. I mean, Bill Aramone was actually, pretty smart in terms of building the brand and being able to strengthen the whole movement and increase its visibility. But then what happened was, we know Aramone, went off the rails with a personal scandal, and it smeared the whole United Way movement. And so you had a movement back to the left-hand side, and those United Ways around the country started building bridges and de-emphasizing the center, so that each one of them could survive and say, we had nothing to do with what was going on with ceremony and Washington. So, these two models, really help to sort of explain the oscillation that took place over time because of this, largely because of this scandal to which they had to be resilient. I mean, I personally think they never really recovered. But
That's
there was a
I
very,
feel the same way. I think they're
Yeah.
still tinged with that, unfortunately. Yeah.
but they fell back on the network to save themselves, which is interesting.
Yeah, and again, I think that's probably the point. I mean, again, Wayskiller and Marciano had to find three very specific organizations to show this being successful on a long-term basis. And this is clearly not for every nonprofit, for every mission at every time. And again, the managerial prerogative comes in to figuring out when this central thing is going to work for you and when it's going to be better for you to head this way. And in a crisis, it's not clear which model necessarily will help you, and different crises might necessitate the different models. Again, part of my goal is just to give you those mental models so you can look at your own network, and if it's not working, figure out, well, my network looks like this one, and maybe my network needs to look like this for me to be resilient. So that's the way I would suggest using any of this. And again, Wayskiller and Marciano, it's really about mission fulfillment. It's not necessarily about organizational growth. And I think they probably say, I haven't seen it, but they'd probably say, look, if we lost one or two organizations along the way, but the mission was being fulfilled by the network, that's a positive. Then, but if you are one of those organizations that gets lost, not so positive for you. So that, this is the kind of thinking, the mission is more important than the individual organizational surviving. And this is just, again, another way to think about networks and resiliency. There's you yourself as a nonprofit practitioner and your network and how you survive in the field. And again, panel members will talk about that. Then there's your organization and how you survive. And then there's the mission that you serve. And if that's better served, if some of the organizations and some of the individuals fall out, but the network itself is bringing the resources to the nodes that need it when the nodes need it. So, so what inhibits networks? So Stuart, to your issue, how do you even create a network? Well, certainly if you want to get into this network nonprofit thing, there are a lot of things that make it hard for organizations to go that way if they want to. And again, only ones with the kind of mission that's broader than the one organization are going to be attracted to this. But so the factors that contribute this is, we know that nonprofit leaders are interested in organizational sustainability. This is the way the board usually measures their success. How much money did you bring in? What were revenues like? I mean, there will be some outcome variable. If a board is good, there will be some, but they're also going to be interested in the bottom line, which is going to mean that managers are going to have to focus there. And any time focus there is not time focused on building your network. The board itself would need to be educated that they need to think more broadly than the organization's financials. They need to think about bringing other organizations in to help with mission fulfillment. That's not something that boards are used to bringing expertise they have from their day jobs in, but they're not necessarily used to thinking about their organization as one node in a larger network. And then donors. Donors also have to be brought up to speed. You're talking about organizations that normally would be competing for funds. A lot of foundations have tried to get those organizations to form networks so that they're no longer competing, but you still have the going after funding, which is a competitive process. You have to get past that to become a truly network nonprofit. So what this network nonprofit is asking you to do is to cast your gaze externally rather than internally. to put mission first and organization second. And again, we all say we do that, but when it comes down to performance reviews and, certainly any of the watchdogs from outside, we tend to, focus on the organization and it's getting through. To do this, well, like the guide dogs and Women's World Banking, governed through trust rather than control. This is not something that boards are used to or can easily be moved to do. And then another tough thing, and again, if you're following Bert's notions of creating a network, this is absolutely antithetical to that, but to cooperate as equal nodes in a constellation rather than a central hub and command. So, something I'm sensing in the room that there might be a little bit of lagging enthusiasm for network stuff. So I could drone on. I've got many more slides to drone on, but I'm sensing that's not probably the best use of our time. So if I can take the initiative and say, maybe this is a good time to break for lunch for about a half an hour. And Tony, I see you just popped in, so possibly worst timing in my history, but if if maybe we what we can do is we can all come back here around 1:15. I can talk to you a little bit more about strategies, and then at 1 o'clock I've got some really exciting people who are going to be much more interesting talking heads for an hour, and that's is that okay, Dennis and Stuart, if I play that game?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great, but I for one have no lagging interest in what you've been doing. I think it's been exciting and interesting, and I like the way you've presented it. So.
Oh, well, thank you. You're too kind.
It's always good to have. It's always good to break for
bored.
lunch, but not because we're bored.
Okay. All right, I love that.
You can refer to it as a bio break.
All right, so
Okay, fair enough.
Yes.
yes, you're giving us a half an hour to 12:45 reconvene. So that's
Yes.
12:45 Eastern time, guys.
I'm sorry, 12:45 Eastern time. And my panelists, you guys can come on at 12:45, but we're not expecting you to be brilliant until 1. So,
This is awesome stuff. So please don't feel anything but wonderful about it. Okay, so
Okay.
I'm going to pause the recording right here.